welcome to Black History Matters 2025. Today, we're looking at Weeksville, a Black community founded in 1838 in Brooklyn, New York. What is unique about Weeksville is that it wasn't just a settlement. It was a statement of Black autonomy, resistance, and self-determination in the face of oppression in a time in which free Black men's ability to vote and to be educated was extremely restricted due to property requirements and when many Black men were still under the yoke of slavery. In exploring the value of the story of Weeksville, we'll explore the historical context, the life of its founder, James Weeks, and the impact that Weeksville had on Black Americans in the 19th century context. 19th century New York. The 1830s were a turbulent time for free Black Americans. Although slavery had been abolished in New York in 1827, Black residents still faced severe discrimination, limited employment opportunities, and political disenfranchisement. In New York, a law required Black men to own $250 worth of property to vote, making land ownership a crucial path to political empowerment. That is roughly $6 million today. In 19th century New York, Black men faced significant barriers to owning $250 worth of property. Unlike white New Yorkers, Black men had limited access to well-paying jobs due to widespread racial discrimination in employment. Many were confined to low-wage labor, such as dock work or domestic service, making it difficult to accumulate wealth. Additionally, discriminatory lending practices and real estate restrictions made purchasing land or property even more challenging, therefore enabling a cycle of poverty to continue among free Black families. While white men, regardless of wealth, gained universal suffrage in 1821, Black men were deliberately excluded from these economic and legal opportunities through various obstacles, ensuring their political disenfranchisement. At the same time, racial violence was escalating, with white-led riots and mobs attacks targeting free Black communities in northern cities, including New York. One significant example of racial violence against Black communities was the anti-abolitionist riot of 1834, also called the Farron Riot or Tappan Riot. This multi-day attack on Black residents and abolitionist supporters was driven by growing racial tensions and hostility towards the anti-slavery movement. White mobs vandalized Black churches, homes, and businesses, targeting institutions associated with abolitionism, such as Black American School, like the one run by Reverend Peter Williams Jr., and the home of abolitionist Lewis Tappan. These riots exposed the vulnerability of Black New Yorkers who faced physical violence when organizing or supporting causes to end slavery. Such violence underscored the need for safe Black communities like Weeksville, where Black Americans could own property, build institutions, and protect themselves and their families from racial hostility. It was in this environment that James Weeks, a Black longshoreman and formerly enslaved person, took action to create a refuge for Black New Yorkers. James Weeks was a Black abolitionist and entrepreneur who founded the community of Weeksville in 1838. Although not much is known about him, he was likely born around 1790. He was, as I mentioned, a formerly enslaved person, but after gaining his freedom, he moved to New York City, where he worked as a stevedore, or a dock worker who loaded and unloaded ships, and a longshoreman. The context in which he worked is also very important. Dock work was a common occupation for free Black men in 19th century New York. The city's economy was heavily dependent on shipping and trade, and labor was always in high demand along the docks. Many free Black men found work as stevedores, sailors, longshoremen, and shipbuilders because these jobs, while physically demanding and often dangerous, did not require formal education or access to capital, barriers that frequently excluded Black workers from other industries. For formerly enslaved men, like James Weeks, he would have likely been deprived of a formal education, and therefore dock work was one of the few careers open to him. However, Black dock workers still faced discrimination and were often paid lower wages than their white counterparts. Despite these challenges, however, dock work provided a steady, though precarious, source of income for black men in cities like New York and Boston, allowing some, like James Weeks, to save money and invest in land or businesses. Likewise, the maritime industry also played a big role in black resistance, as black sailors and dock workers helped spread abolitionist ideas and assisted in the escape of enslaved people via networks like the Underground Railroad, giving them mobility and access to information that their jobs gave them. Recognizing the need for black self-sufficiency and political empowerment, such as owning property to be able to vote, Weeks purchased land in Brooklyn, Kings County, a rural area at the time, for $125 from Henry C. Thompson, a free black owner. He then began selling plots to other free black families with the aim of creating a self-sustaining black community. By the 1850s, Weeksville had grown into a thriving community with over 500 residents, including migrants from across the East Coast and at least 2 individuals born in Africa. A significant portion of the population, nearly 40%, were originally from the South, demonstrating how Weeksville served as a safe haven for people from other parts other than New York. Land ownership was relatively high, with about 1/3 of men over 21 owning property, enfranchising many of them. The village also boasted a range of institutions, including Bethel Tabernacle African Methodist Episcopal Church and Berean Missionary Baptist Church, as well as a cemetery, an old age home, and a school known as Colored School No. 2. Notably, its colored school became the first in the nation to integrate both students and staff, making it a landmark in the fight for educational equality that we would later see in the 20th century. It also founded its own orphanage called the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum. Weeksville was also home to the Freedmen's Torchlight, one of the earliest black abolitionist newspapers. And lastly, Weeksville also played a role as the national headquarters of the African Civilization Society. I believe it is important to mention the mission of the African Civilization Society because it was very similar to the idea of the need to create self-sufficient black communities, except that this society believed that that should be done in Africa. As we mentioned in a previous video, the African Civilization Society was founded in the 1860s by black abolitionists, including Henry Highland Garnet, with the goal of promoting black self-sufficiency and encouraging black Americans to immigrate to Africa. The society believed that black Americans could help develop and civilize Africa while escaping racism and oppression in the United States. It aimed to provide education, vocational training, and Christianary missionary work to establish sustainable communities in Africa. However, the organization faced criticism from those who believed in fighting for black rights within the U.S. rather than immigrating. The example of Weeksville is one of the attempts to create that self-sufficient black community within the boundaries of modern-day United States. During the violent New York draft riots of 1863, the community of Weeksville also served as a refuge for many black Americans who fled from Manhattan. The New York draft riots of 1863 were a violent 4-day uprising in July 1863, primarily led by working-class white New Yorkers who opposed the newly implemented Civil War draft. Many resented that wealthy men could pay a $300 commutation fee to avoid service, while poorer men, particularly Irish immigrants, were forced to fight. The riots quickly turned into a racist massacre, with white mobs attacking black residents, lynching individuals, and burning down buildings, including an orphanage for black children. The riots were one of the deadliest instances of civil unrest in U.S. history, highlighting the deep racial and class tensions in wartime in New York. Therefore, this example of violence served as an example of why Weeksville was an important refuge for black Americans as they fled this violence, and a reminder that safety could only be found in self-sufficient towns of their own. Later, after the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge, and as New York City grew and expanded, Weeksville gradually became part of the neighborhood which is today known as Crown Heights, and the memory of the village was largely forgotten. Weeksville had therefore become a thriving neighborhood with its own churches, schools, and businesses, serving as a haven for Black New Yorkers seeking safety, economic opportunity, and political rights, including a place where they could escape violence. James Weeks' efforts were instrumental in proving that Black Americans could establish prosperous, independent communities despite systemic racism. Weeks was part of a broader movement of Black landowners who understood that land ownership was directly tied to freedom and political power. Weeksville quickly grew as Black residents purchased property, built homes, and established businesses, churches, and schools until it was subsumed into the rest of New York. However, it is still important to think about the overall legacy of Weeksville. It had become much more than just a neighborhood. It was a model for Black self-sufficiency. By the 1850s, it had grown into one of the largest free Black communities in the United States, even before the Civil War. Among the many reasons it stands out are: number one, it was a safe haven for fugitive enslaved people. Weeksville was part of the Underground Railroad, providing shelter and protection for escaped enslaved people seeking freedom in the North. 2. Political empowerment. Because of the property requirements for voting in New York, Weeksville's Black landowners could exercise their political rights, giving them a stronger voice in local and state affairs. 3. Education and institutions. Weeksville established some of the first Black-led institutions, including the abolitionist newspaper The Freedman's Torchlight and the Weeksville School, ensuring that Black children had access to quality education in a time in which it was denied to many of them. And 4. Community strength. When the 1863 draft riots devastated Black communities in Manhattan, Weeksville provided a refuge for those fleeing racial violence and protected its own. Weeksville wasn't just about survival, it was about building a space where people could thrive. Black professionals, business owners, and educators lived there, making a Black community independent and successful, even in a society built on racial exclusion. Furthermore, as we will see in an example next, it was replicated in various places, consciously or not. An example of this replication is Timbuktu. Weeksville was not the only example of how Black Americans sought to find strength in their own self-sufficient neighborhoods and through ownership, enfranchising themselves. Another example was the Timbuktu community in the Adirondacks. The Timbuktu community was founded in the 1840s in upstate New York, near the Adirondacks, as part of an initiative led by abolitionist Gerrit Smith, who sought to help Black men gain land and consequently the right to vote. Smith gifted 40-acre land parcels to around 3,000 free Black men, enabling them to establish a self-sufficient farming community. However, due to the harsh climate, limited resources, and a lack of agricultural experience among many settlers, the project struggled to thrive, and many eventually left the land. Timbuktu and Weeksville share similarities as intentional Black communities created to secure economic independence and political rights in the face of disenfranchisement and limited economic opportunities. If you'd like to learn more about the Timbuktu community, feel free to check out the video we made on it in our Black History in Upstate New York series in 2021. You can click on the playlist in our main YouTube channel page. Although the memory of Weeksville has faded with the growth of New York City, it was brought back into the public's knowledge in the 1960s, and a heritage center now exists which you can visit. The Weeksville Heritage Center was established in the 1960s after a rediscovery of the historic Weeksville community. In 1968, historian James Hurley and activist Joanne Eicher identified remnants of the community while conducting an aerial survey. This discovery spurred efforts to preserve the site, led by local activists, educators, and the newly formed Society for the Preservation of Weeksville and Bedford-Stuyvesant History. Over time, these efforts resulted in the restoration of the remaining historic houses, known as the Hunterfly Road houses, which became the foundation for the Weeksville Heritage Center. Officially established as a cultural and educational institution, the center now serves as a museum dedicated to preserving and interpreting Weeksville's history. Weeksville is currently a working class neighborhood with Black American and Hispanic residents, as well as Caribbean immigrants from Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent, and Grenada, among others. Weeksville is an essential part of American history. It teaches us about the power of land ownership, something pivotal to what would later be termed the American dream, and a continuing issue as we move into the 20th century and think about the fight Black Americans engaged in to gain access to fair housing ownership. Weeksville also teaches us about the value of community building, not only for exerting influence in the fight for equality, but also for ensuring the stability and safety of all of its members. And lastly, it speaks to Black self-determination in one of the most restrictive periods of our nation's history. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Black History Matters 2025. Be sure to check out our upcoming videos as we continue to explore overlooked stories from Black history. The next video will be available on Wednesday, February 19th on our YouTube channel. If you'd like to leave any feedback on this particular video or the program, the link on your screen will take you to a survey where you can leave this feedback. You are also more than welcome to contact the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum at the contact info on your screen, or leave a comment in the comment section below. Thank you.